I wanted to ask you, sort of coming off of that, I know there's a lot of debate in the U.S. Sort of about this new concept that idealism can be the new realism, in the sense that nation building and spreading democracy can sort of drive strategic interests. And I wanted to know if you feel like that's dangerous for development and to what extent that sort of concept is affecting policy at the World Bank, or if it is at all.
Okay, well, so two halves to that. I think it's true that the idealism versus realism dichotomy is, most of the time in real foreign policy it breaks down a bit, because it is, in the U.S. interest to have more democracy around the world, and how realistic was it to ignore the dictatorial aspects of the Shahs in Iran in the 1970s, right? And say it doesn't matter about his internal repression, we'll have a nice relationship with the Shah. In 1979, when he was booted out in the revolution, it meant that the U.S. was frozen out of that country, and we still have the consequences today. So just in terms of looking after U.S. interests, it wasn't smart to be so close to the Shah. And equally, it's not smart and not tenable to sustain democratic support in this country for any kind of foreign policy unless you present it in terms of U.S. ideals. I mean, the American voters, I just don't think, relate to that. They always need to be, you need to tell people that your foreign policy is bearing in mind your values. And right now, of course, there's a reaction against that because of Iraq for very good reasons. That, going in with your values as opposed to with your rational calculations can backfire big time. And so we're in a period of backlash against that. But I think that fundamentally, the old balance will reassert itself. There'll be a mixture of realism and idealism in foreign policy. And you sort of need to think along both tracks if you're making policy. Now, how does this all affect the World Bank? Well, one of the interesting things that happens in foreign aid is that there's sort of always a core amount of support for doing it on kind of humanitarian grounds, but the amount of foreign aid goes up whenever people see a foreign policy reason to be really scared about poverty in the third world. And so I always say there's sort of three periods when this happened. One was when the World Bank was created at the end of the Second World War, and that was very much in response to the experience of the interwar period when hyperinflation and mass unemployment in Germany had led to Nazism, that desperation could lead to desperate isms of fascism and communism. And so to prevent that from happening again, the World Bank was consciously set up with that idea in mind. If we can go and reconstruct Europe quickly, we can avoid that desperation and desperate isms, and this will be good for peace. And so the sort of creation of the World Bank reflects that. Then in 1960, when the soft loan window of the World Bank was grafted onto it, and there was a big expansion in the amount of money and resources the World Bank had at its disposal. Again, this was because of the onset of the Cold War. Castro's revolution had been 1 year earlier. There was a general fear that if you didn't get out there and help poor countries, they would fall into the communist column. And so for US foreign policy reasons, you had to expand aid. And then after 9/11, again, there's been a big expansion in official development assistance as measured by the OECD, especially in America, but across all the donor countries. Because we're worried about failed states. And look at Afghanistan, look what it did to us. But then comes the problem, which is that the foreign policy people give the aid people a bunch of money and say, great, now you can go and fix Afghanistan. And the aid people say, well, wait a minute. We know how to sort of incrementally improve the good performing poor countries. But we don't have a great track record, frankly, in failed states. And the whole sort of, selectivity trend which emerged in aid policy from, let's say, the late 90s to around now, aid will be most effective if you give it to countries which have governments that are pursuing good policies. That's the idea that underpins the Millennium Challenge account set up by this administration to select the countries with good policies and focus resources on them. That's also an idea which has been kicking around the World Bank since the late 90s, with more focusing of money, especially on the soft loan side, to the countries with good policies. So you've got this dichotomy where, the foreign policy people say, oh, we're frightened of failed states, so we'll give you some money. And the aid people say, yeah, but now we're going to spend them not on the failed states, we're going to spend them on the non-failing, good policy ones. And I once gave a talk to an audience where Brent Scowcroft was in the audience. And he said, wait a minute. You're saying that these aid people are taking our money, they're not doing what we so that was the kind of the securocrat perspective. So I think, not surprisingly, bit by bit, the foreign policy types wake up to this, and then that creates the sort of down part of the cycle when foreign assistance starts to dry up, or at least increases less quickly, because it's realized that it's not a panacea for failed states.